The talk show host thought he had the upper hand, until Pam Bondi flipped the conversation and left him scrambling for a comeback. The studio lights were blinding, hotter than she expected. Pam Bondi had faced cameras countless times, debated high-profile cases and stood before crowds of reporters. But today felt different. There was a tension in the air, a quiet edge that sent a message before a single word was spoken. She adjusted her blazer, keeping her posture straight as she sat across from Graham Layton, the sharp-dressed host of the exchange. He had a reputation for pushing his guests to their limits, aggressive questioning, relentless follow-ups, and an uncanny ability to turn interviews into public interrogations. Pam had been invited to discuss law, justice, and her tenure as Florida's Attorney General. But from the moment she stepped onto the set, she knew that wasn't the real plan. The energy in the room was off, cold, expectant. The audience wasn't just watching, they were waiting. A producer counted down. 3, 2, 1. The red light flicked on. Graham leaned in, a practiced smile on his lips, but his eyes stayed sharp. "Pam, welcome to the exchange." She nodded politely. "Thank you for having me." His fingers tapped lightly against the desk. His voice was smooth, but with an unmistakable bite. "You've been at the center of controversy for quite some time. Your tenure as Attorney General, your political stances. Some would say you've made decisions that hurt more people than they helped. Would you say that's fair? No warm-up, no easing in. A direct hit, right out of the gate." Pam had dealt with this approach before, but something about Graham's tone made it clear. This wasn't a discussion. This was a setup. And the audience had caught on too. She kept her expression neutral, unfazed. "I'd say that's an oversimplification of years of work, but if you'd like to discuss specifics, I'm happy to." Graham smirked, tilting his head slightly. "Oh, we'll get to specifics." He turned slightly toward the camera, addressing the audience as if he were letting them in on a secret. "But let's start with something simple. Many Americans, particularly those affected by your policies, feel you're out of touch with their reality, that you've prioritized political gain over what's right. Do you ever stop to consider the people on the other side of your decisions?" It wasn't a real question. It was bait. Pam knew better than to bite. She folded her hands neatly on the desk. "Every decision I've made has been with the intention of upholding the law and protecting citizens. That doesn't mean everyone agrees with me. But leadership isn't about being liked, it's about doing what's necessary, even when it's unpopular." Graham chuckled, shaking his head. "That's convenient. But let's be honest, Pam." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Some would say you've turned a blind eye to justice when it suited you." The room felt smaller. The audience was dead silent now, hanging on every word. Pam remained still, her pulse steady. She had seen this tactic before. Force an emotional reaction, make the guest defensive, get them flustered. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. She met his gaze directly. "You seem eager to make this personal, Graham. I hope you'll allow me to actually answer your questions instead of just throwing accusations." A murmur rippled through the audience. Graham's expression flickered, just for a second. But he wasn't finished. And he was about to make things even uglier. He leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, settling in as if he were preparing for a performance. "Pam, let's talk about power. Politicians, prosecutors, people in your position always claim to serve justice. But justice, it seems, often bends for those with influence." Pam didn't move. She waited. Graham continued, his tone sharpening. "For instance, when you were Attorney General, there were claims that corporate donors received special treatment, investigations that quietly disappeared, people who should have been held accountable, walking away untouched." He gestured toward the audience. "Can you look them in the eye and say that never happened?" A trap. A denial would be met with skepticism. An admission would be twisted beyond recognition. Pam exhaled slowly through her nose. And just like that, the game had changed. Pam kept her voice even. Graham, if you're going to make accusations, at least have the integrity to be specific. What cases are you referring to? Graham smirked, turning toward the camera like he was performing for the viewers at home. Oh, we'll get specific. Don't worry. The audience chuckled, not the kind of laughter that felt light but expectant, hungry for a slip-up. Pam could feel the rhythm of the conversation shifting, the temperature in the room rising. He was painting her as someone squirming under pressure when in reality, she hadn't even begun to push back. Graham glanced down at the stack of papers in front of him. A prop. Whether he actually needed them was irrelevant. They gave the illusion of damning evidence waiting to be revealed. He flipped through them dramatically. Let's start with this. Back during your tenure, there was a lawsuit against a certain corporation, one of your donors, mind you, accused of fraudulent business practices. And then, suddenly, that lawsuit vanished. What a coincidence. Pam pressed her lips together. Now she knew exactly what he was referring to, and exactly how he was twisting it. She started to speak, but Graham cut her off. Tell me, Pam. Why? Should the American people believe that people like you don't just protect the wealthy while the rest of us get left behind? That landed like a punch. The audience murmured. Pam felt it immediately. This was the moment he had been waiting for. A loaded question, designed to make her defensive, to force her into a sound bite he could use against her. She could see it in his eyes. He thought he had her, but he underestimated her. Pam inhaled slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable. Then she leaned forward slightly. You know, Graham, it's interesting how you frame things. He blinked. Just barely, but she caught it. You present this case like it's some grand scandal when in reality it was fully investigated, and the claims didn't hold up. No cover-up, no backroom deals, just the legal process playing out as it should. But that wouldn't make for a very exciting headline, would it? The audience shifted. She could hear whispers. The weight in the room had started to shift, but Graham wasn't done. He never expected a guest to roll over, and he knew how to keep pressing. So you're saying money never influenced any of your decisions? Pam met his stare. I'm saying facts did. And I find it interesting that instead of discussing those facts, you'd rather insinuate corruption with no proof. The audience reacted, some nodding, some still wary. But the tide wasn't as clearly in Graham's favor anymore. He could feel it too. So he changed tactics. His next question was about to get personal. And that's where he made his biggest mistake. Graham's smirk widened. The weight of the conversation was tilting against him, and he wasn't about to let that happen. If the political angle wasn't enough to rattle Pam, he had another card to play. He shifted in his seat, his voice taking on a more casual, almost amused tone. Let's put politics aside for a moment. Let's talk about character. Pam didn't react. She knew where this was going. Graham tilted his head slightly. You've built a reputation as a tough prosecutor, a woman who stands by her principles. But what happens when those principles only seem to apply when it's convenient? The audience tensed. He continued, his voice dripping with feigned curiosity. You talk about justice, about the law being fair. But do you remember the protests outside that movie theater in Tampa? Because a lot of people do. A shift in the room. Pam knew exactly what he was referring to. It had been a hot summer evening. She had gone to see a documentary. Nothing political, nothing controversial. But outside the theater, a group of protesters had been waiting. They shouted insults, called her a disgrace, accused her of ignoring their concerns. And then, as she walked past them, someone spat at her. It had been caught on camera, circulated for days. Some had called it justified outrage. Others had called it assault. Pam's jaw tightened slightly, but she kept her voice controlled. Yes, I remember. Graham leaned in. People were angry. Some of them had lost everything because of policies you defended, and instead of engaging, you walked away. Some would say that's cowardly. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Pam felt a familiar frustration creeping in. He wasn't interested in the truth, just the most scandalous version of it. She exhaled slowly. Let's be clear, Graham. You're talking about a situation where I was harassed in public. Where I was physically assaulted, are you suggesting? So I should have just stood there and taken it? The question hung in the air, sharp as a blade. Graham raised an eyebrow, his expression carefully neutral. Pam leaned in, her voice slicing through the charged silence. If that's what you're suggesting, I'd love to hear you say it outright. No dodging, no spin. Let's hear you defend mob intimidation. On national television. A pause. For the first time, Graham hesitated. The audience wasn't just watching a guest on the defensive anymore. They were watching the host get called out. He shifted slightly, then recovered. I'm saying that when people are desperate, they act out. When leaders ignore them, they feel abandoned. Pam held his gaze. Desperation doesn't justify violence. Her voice was measured, unwavering. Would you say the same if the victim had been someone else? A journalist, a politician you support? Or do the rules change depending on the target? A murmur rippled through the audience. Graham exhaled through his nose, his irritation surfacing. So now you're playing the victim? Pam leaned back slightly. I don't have to. The footage speaks for itself, but if you'd rather talk about the real issues instead of manufacturing drama, I'm happy to. Silence. Graham flipped a page in his notes, recalibrating, but the energy in the room had shifted. Pam wasn't just holding her ground, she was taking control, and Graham wasn't about to let that stand. That's when he made his second mistake. He inhaled sharply, glancing down as if choosing his next move carefully. The cracks in his confidence were subtle, but they were there. He wasn't used to losing control. Pam, on the other hand, was watching, waiting, ready. So Graham pivoted. If a personal attack hadn't rattled her, he'd go for something bigger. He set his papers down, laced his fingers together, and fixed Pam with a look just shy of condescending. Let's be honest here, Pam. You've spent your career defending people and policies that most Americans find, frankly, problematic. He let the words settle, then went in for the hit. If you weren't in politics, if you didn't have power, do you really think you'd be sitting here right now? Or would you be just another person left behind by the system you protect? A clever move, designed to paint her as privileged. Out of touch, Pam tilted her head unfazed. That's an interesting argument, Graham. You're saying that because I worked in the system I don't understand it? Graham smirked. I'm saying you benefited from it. Pam leaned forward. You seem to have a lot of opinions about my past. So let me ask you something. What's your definition of justice? Graham blinked. Excuse me? She gestured toward him. You sit here implying corruption, favoritism, that I only got where I am because of privilege. So tell me, Graham, what's your definition of justice? Is it about who shouts the loudest? Who makes the most accusations? Or is it about facts? His lips parted slightly, searching for a response. Pam didn't give him the chance. Because if you're so certain the system is broken, I'd love to hear your solution. Silence. A murmur rippled through the audience. Graham's fingers curled slightly against the desk. That's not my job, Pam. She nodded. Exactly. Your job is to stir controversy, to frame things a certain way, to make people think there's always a scandal, always a conspiracy. But let's be honest. You don't actually care about justice. You care about the spectacle. A few gasps. A low hum of approval. Graham blinked, his composure slipping. Pam sat back. So, if we're done with the theatrics, I'd love to talk about the real issues. But if you just want sound bites, let me know. I'd hate to waste your time. The studio was suffocating with tension. For the first time, Graham looked caught, like he hadn't prepared for this moment, like he hadn't expected her to flip the script so effectively. He glanced at the camera, then back at Pam, exhaling through his nose. All right, he said, voice tighter than before. Let's talk about the issues. But he wasn't in control anymore, and the audience knew it. Graham drummed his fingers lightly against the desk, a subtle tell. This wasn't going the way he had planned. He was supposed to control the tempo, to keep his guest on the defensive. But somehow Pam had turned the tide, and now, the weight of the room wasn't on his side. Graham forced a smile, though it was noticeably tighter than before. All right, Pam, you want to talk about facts? Let's talk about facts. Pam nodded, waiting. Graham flipped through his notes, though the gesture felt more like a stalling tactic than a necessary step. You've been in the legal world for years. Prosecutor, attorney general, consultant. A lot of power. A lot of influence. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Yet somehow, every time controversy arises, you come out clean. He leaned forward slightly. Some people might find that suspicious. Pam raised an eyebrow. Are you accusing me of something? Graham spread his hands. I'm saying the average person doesn't have that luxury. When they get tangled up in the legal system, they don't walk away unscathed. Pam's expression didn't waver. The law isn't about luxury, Graham. It's about understanding how it works and knowing how to navigate it. That applies to everyone, including me. Graham smirked again, but this time it was weaker. That's easy to say when you have the resources to fight back. Pam exhaled slowly. You're right. Not everyone has the same resources, but that's why understanding the law matters. That's why due process exists. That's why cases can't be tried based on public outrage or headlines. Graham opened his mouth, but Pam wasn't finished. In fact, that's exactly what we're doing right now, isn't it? She tilted her head. You're not interested in facts. You're interested in framing me as some kind of privileged elite who dodges accountability. But you have no proof, no case. Just vague accusations meant to stir the pot. A murmur spread through the audience. The shift was undeniable. Graham's jaw clenched, just for a fraction of a second. He was losing them, and he could feel it. Pam leaned forward slightly. So tell me, Graham, what do you actually want from this conversation? Do you want to discuss real issues, or are we just here to entertain the people at home with a one-sided spectacle? Graham inhaled sharply, shifting in his seat. I think the people at home want transparency. Pam nodded. Great. Then let's be transparent. Let's talk about why you keep interrupting me. Why you frame things a certain way. Why, instead of discussing policy, you prefer to throw out accusations without evidence. More murmurs. Some audience members actually nodded. Pam continued, her voice unwavering. Because, Graham, if your goal was to have a real discussion, you wouldn't be doing this. Graham forced out a chuckle. I'm just asking tough questions, Pam. She gave him a knowing smile. No, you're trying to make a headline. Silence. Graham glanced toward the producer as if looking for an out, but there wasn't one. The room was no longer hanging on his words. It was hanging on hers. And then, from the back of the audience, someone started clapping. It was hesitant at first, a single person. Then another joined in, and another. The applause grew, rippling across the room. It wasn't an explosive standing ovation, but it didn't have to be. Because in that moment it was clear who had won. Graham swallowed and straightened his papers again. But it was just to keep his hands busy. The interview wasn't over. But it might as well have been. Pam Bondi had just turned the tables and everyone in the room knew it. Graham cleared his throat, forcing a tight-lipped smile as the applause finally died down. His grip on the conversation had slipped through his fingers, and now there was no getting it back. Pam sat still, composed. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't smirking. She had made her point, and the audience had seen it for themselves. Graham tried to salvage what was left. Well, Pam, it seems you've certainly made an impression here today. She met his gaze. I tend to do that. A flicker of irritation crossed his face, but he masked it quickly. He had to wrap things up, without making it obvious that he had lost control. Well, he said, shifting his papers as if the interview had gone exactly as planned. I think that's about all the time we have. I appreciate you coming on and giving your perspective. Pam nodded. I appreciate the opportunity. Next time, maybe we can have an actual discussion instead of a performance. The audience chuckled. Graham forced another tight smile but didn't respond. He turned to the camera, his voice slightly strained. That was Pam Bondi, former Attorney General of Florida. We'll be right back after this. The moment the red recording light switched off, Graham pushed back his chair and stood, rubbing the bridge of his nose. His earpiece buzzed with frantic voices from the control room, but he ignored it. Pam stood as well, smoothing out her blazer. She turned to Graham, her tone polite but firm. If you ever decide you actually want a real conversation, let me know. He let out a quiet scoff. I ask the questions people want answered. Pam gave a small smile. No. You ask the questions that get clicks. And with that, she turned and walked. Offset. The second she stepped into the hallway, her phone lit up with notifications. Twitter, Facebook, news alerts. She tapped on a trending topic. Pam Bondi unfiltered clips of the interview had already hit social media. People were dissecting every moment. Her pushback, Graham's struggle to recover, the audience's shift in energy. Some called it a takedown, others called it a rare moment when a guest refused to be steamrolled by a hostile interviewer. She scrolled past a few tweets. I don't care what you think of Pam Bondi, this is how you handle a setup. Graham thought he had the upper hand until Pam Bondi flipped the script. That was brutal. This interview is a masterclass in staying calm under pressure. Watch and learn. Of course, there were critics too, people twisting her words, trying to frame her as evasive, defensive. But the narrative was clear. She hadn't just survived the interview, she had owned it. As she stepped outside into the cool evening air, she took a deep breath. This was politics, this was media. And if there was one thing she had learned, it was that no matter how hard someone tries to control the conversation, the truth always finds its way through.